There are moments in history when a single conversation carries the weight of a nation's destiny. When leaders sit across the table, it is not just words exchanged. It is hope, survival, and the future of millions resting in the balance. Ukraine's leader walked into such a moment, carrying the cries of his people, yearning for strength, for unity, for light in the face of darkness. What he sought was protection, what he desired was partnership, and what he received revealed a deeper truth about power and sacrifice. Tonight, we journey through that story, one of faith, courage, and awakening. When Volodymyr Zelenskyy stepped into that meeting, his eyes weren't just fixed on pleasantries or handshakes. He carried with him the weight of a nation standing at a dangerous crossroads. Ukraine was bruised by ongoing conflict, worn down by years of uncertainty, and caught in the shadow of Russia's aggressive ambitions. In that moment, what Zelenskyy wanted most was clear and simple: unwavering support from the United States. Not half promises, not vague reassurances, but firm commitments that America had Ukraine's back in the struggle for survival and sovereignty. Military aid was at the top of his list. Tanks, weapons, defense systems, tools that could make the difference between holding the line or watching territory slip away. But this wasn't just about machinery of war. It was about sending a message. If the U.S. stood shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, it meant Russia would think twice before tightening its grip. It meant Ukraine would not be isolated in its fight for independence. Yet Zelenskyy's expectations reached beyond the battlefield. He sought political backing, the kind that comes with clear declarations on the world stage. Every word of support from America's leadership could echo far beyond Kiev, resonating in the halls of Europe and striking at the heart of Moscow's ambitions. For Zelenskyy, this was about strength through unity. He also knew that symbolic gestures carried as much weight as material aid. A powerful statement of alliance, a public show of solidarity, these could boost morale within Ukraine and reassure its people that they were not standing alone in the storm. That is what he envisioned as he looked across the table: a moment of clarity, a promise of partnership, a lifeline of support that could change the trajectory of his nation's future. For Zelenskyy, NATO was more than just an alliance. It was a shield, a guarantee that Ukraine would not be left vulnerable in the face of Russian aggression. As he entered discussions with Trump, one of his central hopes was to hear a strong, unmistakable endorsement for Ukraine's path toward NATO. He knew the significance of such words. They would not only reassure his people, but also send a signal to Moscow that the West stood firm, united, and unwilling to allow Ukraine to fall back into the orbit of Russian influence. The promise of NATO membership represented security, but it also carried political weight. If the U.S., the leading power in the alliance, voiced full support, then the doors to greater cooperation, training, and long-term defense planning would swing wider open. Zelenskyy envisioned Trump backing Ukraine's bid with boldness, reinforcing the idea that freedom, loving nations stand together, and that Ukraine had earned its place at the table. This hope wasn't simply about protection. It was about legitimacy. Being on the path to NATO meant recognition that Ukraine's sacrifices, its reforms, and its democratic strides were acknowledged by the world's most powerful nations. It meant elevating Ukraine's global standing, showing its people that their struggles were not in vain, and proving to Russia that intimidation could not dictate Ukraine's destiny. In Zelenskyy's view, even a strong verbal commitment would have been a victory. Just the reassurance that Ukraine's alignment with NATO was supported by Washington would have energized his nation's resolve. It would have offered a vision of a future where Ukraine wasn't merely surviving on its own, but standing alongside the world's most powerful militaries, shielded by a collective promise of defense. While security and defense were urgent priorities, Zelenskyy also understood that a nation cannot fight wars forever without rebuilding what lies behind the front lines. Ukraine's economy was struggling under the weight of conflict, corruption scars from the past, and the uncertainty that came with political instability. When he sat across from Trump, he carried the hope that beyond military hardware, there would be a conversation about prosperity, about laying the foundation for Ukraine's economic survival and growth. Zelenskyy sought tangible financial assistance that could stabilize the country's fragile economy. Aid packages, grants, or structured loans from the U.S. could inject immediate relief, keeping public services afloat and ensuring his government could continue paying salaries, maintaining infrastructure, and supporting citizens battered by years of unrest. More than survival, he hoped for signals of future stability, commitments that showed Ukraine was worth investing in. Trade partnerships were another lifeline he envisioned. Access to American markets, joint ventures, and cooperative business opportunities could transform Ukraine's economic outlook. In Zelenskyy's mind, such moves would not just benefit his nation, but create long-term ties between Washington and Kiev, ties that would be hard to break even when political winds shifted. Beyond aid and trade, he looked for investment promises. Foreign capital flowing into Ukraine could modernize industries, improve technology, and generate jobs that would strengthen the nation from within. Zelenskyy knew that economic strength was inseparable from national security. A weak economy made Ukraine vulnerable, while a growing one fortified its independence. Every dollar pledged, every deal signed, every investment hinted at carried symbolic power. It would tell the Ukrainian people that the world believed in their future, that America was not only a distant supporter, but an active partner in rebuilding a nation determined to rise from the ashes of conflict. Sometimes, what a leader seeks is not measured in weapons or dollars, but in gestures that speak louder than any contract. For Zelenskyy, one of the most vital things he wanted from his meeting with Trump was a symbol of solidarity. He understood that the perception of unity could be as powerful as military aid or financial assistance. A firm handshake in front of the cameras, a strong declaration of friendship, or even a bold statement of support could ignite hope within Ukraine and send ripples across the global stage. This symbolism mattered deeply because Ukraine was fighting not just a physical war, but a psychological one. Every citizen needed reassurance that their sacrifices were not in vain, that they were not standing alone in the storm. A visible show of American support would strengthen the spirit of the people, boost their resilience, and remind them that the world's most powerful democracy recognized their struggle. Zelenskyy also saw symbolic unity as a deterrent to Russia. If Moscow saw Washington and Kiev firmly aligned, it would complicate any narrative that Ukraine was isolated or abandoned. It would show that every move against Ukraine was a move against the wider democratic world. Such optics could shape Russia's calculations as much as actual sanctions or military aid. Even within international politics, appearances carry weight. A shared press conference, a photograph that captured partnership, or a statement of mutual commitment could amplify Ukraine's voice in Europe and among allies. For Zelenskyy, this was about more than diplomacy. It was about morale, confidence, and the psychology of survival. A simple symbol, delivered with conviction, could galvanize a nation's will and affirm that their fight was not a solitary one but part of a larger struggle for freedom and sovereignty. When Zelenskyy came seeking clarity, what he encountered instead was a leader weighing every word against the backdrop of his own political landscape. For Trump, foreign policy was never just about distant nations. It was about how each move would echo back home. Every promise, every gesture, every signal of support had to fit into the broader narrative of his re-election campaign and his standing with the American people. Ukraine's needs were undeniable, but in Trump's eyes, they had to be balanced against the realities of U.S. politics. This meant that his approach to Zelenskyy was often filtered through questions of advantage. How would military aid play in the eyes of his supporters? Would a strong stance against Russia strengthen his image or open him up to criticism? Even the language of solidarity was weighed carefully, not just for its impact abroad, but for its resonance within America's polarized political climate. Zelenskyy may have entered the meeting expecting straightforward answers, but instead, he found himself navigating a landscape of shifting priorities. Trump's focus wasn't solely on the Ukrainian battlefield. It was also on the domestic battlefield of American politics. The urgency of Ukraine's survival collided with the urgency of Trump's campaign strategy, and in that collision, clarity was lost. At the heart of it, Trump's calculations weren't necessarily about rejecting Ukraine's needs, but about aligning them with his vision of strength, negotiation, and personal political capital. For him, every international relationship was a transaction, every promise a bargaining chip. Ukraine, in that moment, became part of a much larger game, one that stretched beyond Kiev and Moscow, reaching into Washington and the minds of American voters. It was a reminder that for powerful leaders, global decisions often begin with personal politics. For all the anticipation Zelenskyy carried into that meeting, the outcome left him with far less than he had envisioned. What he encountered were not firm commitments but vague assurances, words that seemed to promise support, yet stopped short of delivering the kind of guarantees Ukraine desperately needed. Military aid was spoken of, but tied with conditions and delays, leaving Zelenskyy uncertain whether help would arrive when it mattered most. The bold declarations he hoped to hear were replaced with carefully measured statements, crafted more for political maneuvering than for the urgent needs of a nation under threat. Instead of walking away with clarity, Zelenskyy found himself holding fragments, pieces of promises that could be reinterpreted or reshaped depending on circumstances. For a leader who had sought strength, this lack of certainty felt like a shadow cast over his country's future. The lifeline of economic assistance remained a discussion rather than a commitment, leaving Ukraine still searching for concrete paths to rebuild its battered economy. The symbolism of solidarity, which could have sent a powerful message to both allies and adversaries, was watered down by ambiguity. Rather than a clear show of unity, Zelenskyy received gestures that left room for doubt, gestures that could be read differently by Kiev, Washington, or Moscow depending on the day. This reality underscored the difficult position Ukraine found itself in. Zelenskyy had entered the room carrying the hopes of his people, but he left with only partial answers, unsure how much of what was said would translate into action. The meeting revealed the harsh truth that Ukraine's struggles were not always treated as urgent priorities, but as elements woven into larger strategies and calculations beyond its control. It was a sobering reminder of the gulf between expectation and reality. What became clear in the aftermath of Zelenskyy's meeting was not just the gap between expectation and reality, but the message that gap carried to the world. Ukraine's struggle, as urgent and desperate as it was, became entangled in the larger chessboard of global politics. Instead of finding his nation at the center of discussion, Zelenskyy realized it was being positioned as a piece in negotiations between greater powers. His country's survival was not merely about right and wrong, freedom and oppression. It was also about leverage, strategy, and influence in a contest that stretched far beyond Ukraine's borders. This dynamic revealed a painful truth for smaller nations. Their fate is often determined not only by their own will, but by the interests of those who hold greater power. Zelenskyy wanted assurance that Ukraine's voice mattered, that its sovereignty carried weight on its own merit. Yet what unfolded showed how easily a country's urgent needs could be overshadowed by the calculations of leaders managing alliances, rivalries, and domestic agendas. The larger message resonated on two levels. To Ukraine, it signaled the difficulty of securing unconditional backing when powerful nations view every commitment as a bargaining chip. To the international community, it highlighted the fragility of trust when alliances are tested by political self-interest. What Zelenskyy experienced was not unique to his nation. It was a reflection of how global politics often operates, where ideals of unity and freedom collide with the realities of negotiation and power. In that meeting, what emerged was not only the story of one leader seeking support and receiving far less, but also the reminder that the destinies of smaller nations are often written in rooms where they hold a seat at the table, yet not always the final word. Zelenskyy's meeting was not just about promises gained or lost, but about the reality of navigating a world where power speaks louder than need. He walked in with hope, with expectations of strength and unity, yet what he carried out was a reminder that global politics is rarely straightforward. His struggle reflects the broader struggle of smaller nations fighting to be seen, heard, and supported. May we learn from this moment to value truth over calculation, unity over division, and courage over compromise. Thank you for listening, and may strength and wisdom guide you always. Good luck.